Do Christians need to keep the Jewish law, or has it all been abolished? Well, each gospel has a different view on this matter, and in this video, we'll just be comparing the views of the Gospel of Mark and Matthew. Now, the first thing that we must appreciate was that Mark was written first. He is our earliest gospel, and Mark does not believe in keeping the Jewish law. He believes it has been abolished. Now, after Mark, Matthew wrote his own gospel and used Mark as a source. Now, Matthew totally disagrees with Mark and believes that the law must be obeyed. And in this video, I'll be showing you that Matthew adds, edits, and omits from Mark to highlight that the law must be kept. We're going to begin with the hand-washing controversy, which is found in Mark 7 and Matthew chapter 15. In Mark 7, we read, "Now, when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them." End quote. Mark then adds an editorial note. Most translations will put this in brackets. And in this editorial note, Mark is directly speaking to his Gentile audience and is attempting to explain this Jewish practice of washing your hands. We read, quote, "For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash, and there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups and pots and bronze kettles and beds." End quote. Mark then continues writing, quote, "So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, 'Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?'" End quote. Now, interestingly, in Matthew's version of this account, he omits Mark's editorial note. And the most likely reason why Matthew omits it is because Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience who already know about the tradition of the elders. As one author notes, quote, "Matthew omits Mark's explanatory insertion regarding Jewish purification rituals. These omissions reflect the Jewish background of Matthew's audience." End quote. Now, before we continue, we need to make something very clear. This Jewish practice of washing your hands is a tradition of the elders, not a biblical kosher law. It was just something that the Pharisees had invented and were forcing their fellow Jews to keep. And both Mark and Matthew agree that the tradition of the elders are bad and should be rejected. But here comes the important part. In Mark's version of this story, he begins by rejecting the tradition of the elders, but then Mark changes the topic and also rejects the biblical kosher laws as well. Now, when Matthew reads Mark's version of this story, he totally disagrees and was probably in shock that Mark would dare say that we no longer need to keep the law. So he rewrites his own version of this story, but importantly, Matthew stays on topic and only ever rejects the tradition of the elders and never even mentions the biblical kosher laws. Because Matthew believes his audience should continue keeping the biblical kosher laws. Matthew thus transforms this story into yet another account of Jesus criticizing the Pharisees as being poor interpreters of the Bible. And this is, of course, something Matthew loves doing. He loves criticizing the Jewish leadership and portraying them as evil, as we've seen in previous videos. Okay, let's now see all of this in action. We're going to begin by reading through Mark verse 15. So this is Mark 7 verse 15. It reads, quote, "There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile." So in verse 15, it seems Mark is disregarding the biblical kosher laws by saying that there is nothing outside a person that can defile him. Well, what about pork and shellfish and all those things outlined in the law that says will make us defiled? Well, according to Mark, nothing outside a person can defile them. Thus, the biblical kosher laws seem to be obsolete. Now, Matthew doesn't like this, so he slightly changes it and takes the edge off it. Matthew says, quote, "It's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth that defiles." Matthew then adds an attack on the Pharisees that we don't find in Mark. We read, quote, "Then the disciples approached and said to him, 'Do you know that the Pharisees took offense when they heard what you said?' He answered, 'Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind. And if one blind person guides another, both will fall into a pit.'" So this is a unique addition that Matthew makes in order to criticize the Pharisees. Because remember, Matthew takes this story as a criticism of the Pharisees, not as Mark. This story functions as a way of making the Jewish law obsolete. Okay, now we come to the major change. This is the important one, so listen carefully. In Mark we read, When he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. He said to them, "So are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart but the stomach and goes into the sewer? Thus he declared all foods clean." End quote. And there we go. Here in verse 19, a very clear and decisive rejection of the biblical kosher laws. All foods are now clean. So again, Mark has added in this editorial note, this time to interpret what Jesus is saying, and Mark is telling his audience they no longer need to keep the Jewish law. Matthew, of course, is appalled by this. So when he rewrites his version of this account, we shouldn't be surprised that he omits this editorial note. And the only logical reason why Matthew would omit this is because he expects his audience to keep kosher and continue to keep all of the Jewish law. The scholar Sarah L. Cook, in her doctoral dissertation, writes the following, quote, "Matthew has eliminated Mark's conclusion that Jesus declared all foods clean, arguably Mark's most definitive statement on the Torah in his gospel. It is a reasonable conclusion that Matthew did not see his newly edited story as disregarding any food laws." Mark's version of this story then is firstly about the Pharisaic tradition of hand washing, but then changes to the topic of food laws in the Torah, which Mark effectively dismisses with his comments in 7:15 and 7:19, end quote. Finally, at the very end of this story, we find something very interesting as well. Mark says, quote, "And he said, 'It is what comes out of a person that defiles. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, debauchery, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these things come from within, and they defile a person.'" Now, when Matthew writes his version of the story, he keeps all of this exactly the same, but adds one additional line. "But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile." Now, I know this is only the addition of a single line, but it's of huge significance. By adding in this concluding line, Matthew is reassuring his audience that Jesus is only talking about the hand-washing issue we began with. Matthew is making it abundantly clear that he's staying on topic. This story is only about Jesus denouncing the tradition of the elders and is not a repudiation of the biblical kosher laws. Our scholar again, Sarah L. Cook, writes the following, quote, "In ending the conversation with Jesus referring to the original topic of hand washing, Matthew ensures that the entire discussion, including the reference to what goes in does not defile, is only about the Pharisaic tradition, not about wider Jewish food laws." We continue. With his amendments, Matthew has taken what was a passage that nullified Jewish food laws and has reformed it so that it is yet another criticism of the Pharisees. Due to the conscious amendments to Mark in Matthew's gospel, the food laws of the Torah remain intact. End quote. Okay. There is just our very first example about how Matthew feels about the law and how he has adapted Mark's account in order to promote the kosher laws. The kosher laws are still intact in Matthew's gospel. But now I want to move on and talk about the Sabbath laws and see all the examples in Mark and Matthew about this. But before we do that, please take some time, hit that like, comment, leave me a comment. Hit the like button, leave me a comment, and subscribe. And if you truly want to support the channel, please consider becoming a patron. The link's below. The goal of this channel is to create a library of videos that objectively and respectfully analyze the Bible. And by becoming a patron, you help me achieve that goal. All right, let's now get back to the topic. We're now going to ask the question, do Christians need to keep the Sabbath? Mark says no. Matthew says yes. What's the right answer? Well, we're going to go through 3 examples, and we're going to begin with the Olivet Discourse. Here, Jesus is predicting the future destruction of the temple and how this will be a terrible time for all humanity. This is found in Mark 13 and Matthew 24. In Mark 13, we read, quote, "Pray that it may not be in winter, for in those days there will be suffering such as not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now and never will be," end quote. In Matthew 24, we read, quote, "Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath." And then he continues on the same. So why does Matthew add in this hope that this terrible day will not be on a Sabbath? Well, the logical answer is that Matthew expects his community to be observing the Sabbath, and therefore it would be a catastrophe if this day landed on a Sabbath because they would not be ready. The other 2 examples that we're going to focus on are the Sabbath controversies. So this is when the Pharisees criticized Jesus for plucking grain on the Sabbath and also healing a withered hand on the Sabbath. Let's begin with the plucking the grain story. This is found in Mark chapter 2 and Matthew chapter 12. In Mark we read, quote, One Sabbath, as he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" End quote. Now, in Mark's version, he simply adds that the reason why they plucked grain was because his disciples were hungry. Our scholar writes, quote, Matthew adds that the disciples were hungry. This single detail has several implications. That the disciples were in need, that they were not unnecessarily disregarding the Sabbath. Their hunger also forms a stronger parallel with the David story Jesus later tells. Okay, we now continue to read what Mark has written, and we now come to verse 25. And he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food, how he entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat?" End quote. Now, when Matthew rewrites this, he only makes one change, and this change has nothing to do with the Sabbath. So please bear with me on this detour. The one change Matthew makes has to do with Abiathar the high priest. Matthew will omit this reference to Abiathar the high priest. So why does he do this? Well, if you go read the account of David going into the temple and eating the holy bread, which is found in 1 Samuel 21, the high priest is not Abiathar. Rather, the high priest is Amalek. Matthew has obviously realized Mark's error and therefore removed Abiathar's name. Again, this has nothing to do with the topic before us, but nonetheless, a fun piece of trivia. Okay. Back onto the topic, Matthew has also noticed an issue that this example has of David eating the temple bread. The issue is it has nothing to do with breaking the Sabbath. David didn't eat the bread on the Sabbath. Our scholar again notes, quote, Mark's example of David is not related to the Sabbath, but instead is about the eating of forbidden bread, a mistake which Matthew is likely to have picked up on. So on top of this example, Matthew adds an additional example from Jewish tradition. Here is the other example that Matthew adds, quote, "Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and yet are guiltless? I tell you something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless." End quote. We now continue on. Mark will then say at the very end, quote, "Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." End quote. Now, this line that the Sabbath was made for humans and not humans for the Sabbath is downplaying the Sabbath. It's saying the Sabbath isn't that important. Humans are more important than the Sabbath. So it is a critique of the law. It therefore shouldn't surprise us then that Matthew again omits this reference. He does not say that the Sabbath was made for humans and not humans for the Sabbath. Our scholar again will note, quote, "Finally, Matthew eliminates Mark's statement that the Sabbath was made for man, again lessening the disregard of the Sabbath that Mark's version of the story carries." Once again, Matthew's seemingly small adjustments to Mark have a huge impact on the meaning of the narrative. The story is not one about the disciples transgressing the Sabbath, but about Jesus' superiority in knowing and interpreting the law. The first Sabbath controversy, therefore, is not an issue of the importance of the Sabbath, as it was in Mark, but about Jesus' authority over the Pharisees to interpret the scriptures. End quote. Our next Sabbath controversy is Jesus healing a withered hand on the Sabbath. This is found in Mark chapter 2 and Matthew chapter 12. And there isn't many differences between Mark and Matthew's version, so we don't need to do an in-depth analysis of this story. But Matthew again adds an additional example to justify Jesus' decision to work on the Sabbath. Unique to Matthew, we read, quote, "He said to them, suppose one of you has one sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath. Will you not lay hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a human being than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." End quote. Our scholar notes, quote, "Matthew added an example of a sheep that falls into a pit to further Jesus' justification, but otherwise the changes are minimal, because Mark's story fits in with Matthew's principle of mercy in application of the law. Thus, the story is another example of interpreting the Sabbath through the legal lens." End quote. Okay, so from these three examples, it's pretty clear that Matthew expects his audience to keep the Sabbath, just as he expects them to keep kosher based on what we saw in the hand-washing controversy story. With all of this background, we now come to the most conclusive evidence that Matthew expects his readers to keep the law. This is found in Matthew chapter 5, on the Sermon on the Mount. Here, Jesus will say the following, And this is really important, so listen carefully. Quote, "Do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." End quote. This passage is of huge significance. Our scholar writes, quote, "Given its directiveness, chapter 5, 17 to 19 is the single most important passage on the law in Matthew, and various aspects of the passage highlight its importance. The Matthean Jesus' words in this passage are extremely plain. He is advocating upholding the entire Torah, and so it can be reasonably expected that the Matthean community held the same standard." End quote. So in reading Matthew chapter 5, in the context of the stories regarding the Sabbath and the kosher laws, it is clear that Matthew expects his audience to keep the law. Now, before I conclude, I just want to briefly add 3 unique elements in Matthew that I really feel prove this point even more. Only in Matthew does Jesus instruct his followers to obey the Pharisees when they sit on the seat of Moses. We read, quote, "Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, 'The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore do whatever they teach you and follow it. But do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach.'" Again, only in Matthew are we told that Jesus was truly faithful to the temple by paying his temple tax. And finally, only in Matthew do we have this unique reading about being repaid for your actions. We read, quote, "For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done." End quote. Again, only in Matthew do we have this addition of people being repaid for what they have done. And I think this can be read in the context of being faithful and keeping the law. So I feel when we look at all of these examples, it's very clear that Matthew expects his audience to keep the law. To quote from Sarah L. Cook one last time, let's read her conclusion on this topic. Quote, "In sum, analysis of the first gospel demonstrates that the Matthean community saw themselves as upholding the entire law, saw Jesus as the ultimate authority on interpreting the law, and saw the law as an integral part of their overall moral and consequently apocalyptic theology. For Matthew, the law was not merely an ancient tradition, but a current issue that constantly came up in arguments with the Pharisees and that was being fulfilled in Jesus' ministry. As such, Matthew is more conservative on the issue of the law than was Mark, and he has adapted and adjusted his source in order to fit in with more conservative views. And that is where we're going to end this discussion. Hopefully, I have proved to you that Matthew expects his audience to keep the law. If you've enjoyed this video and you've learned something new, please consider hitting that like button, leave me a comment, and subscribing. And the people who truly keep this channel going are my patrons, so please consider becoming a patron if you're in a position to give. Thank you so much for watching until the end. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, bye-bye.